Hi, everyone. I want to take a few minutes today to talk to you about the healing evangelists of the 20th century. Um, they, many of them were prominent, influential, globally speaking, and um, um, and certainly brought a lot of notoriety uh, to the Pentecostal movement because the vast majority of them were actually Pentecostal. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. And the majority of them came about after World War II. However, there were a few significant evangelists who came to notoriety in the next generation after the Azusa Street revival. The first one that we already spoke about last week was Amy Semple McPherson. And interestingly enough, she passed away um, before at the end of World War II, I believe. At her funeral, there were more people, I believe, that attended her funeral than anyone else in North America in the first half of the 20th century. She's noted as one of the top 100 most influential people of the 20th century in North America. And her influence was significant, not just within Pentecostal circles, but with throughout society. Um, one particular evangelist who was actually influenced directly by Amy Semple McPherson was Charles Price. He was a Methodist preacher who was reticent of or cautious, um, really antagonistic towards the Pentecostal movement, but he decided to come to one of her meetings. He was skeptical, but when he attended one of her meetings, he fell on his face um, before the presence of God and was baptized in the Holy Spirit at that meeting. And he wound up becoming one of the most influential um, evangelists, certainly on the west coast of the United States. It's estimated, in particular, he had significant influence in California, but it's estimated that in the northwestern United States, that currently um, nearly half of all Pentecostal churches in the Northwest United States that were established before 1950 were were launched out of an evangelistic crusade by Charles Price. One of those most notably was a church in Eugene, Oregon, that became the largest Pentecostal church in the United States for a period of time. It had over 5,000 members. It was called Lighthouse Temple. Um, but um, but interestingly, both he um, and Amy Semple McPherson passed away at the end of World War II, which left a void um, in the Pentecostal movement as far as leaders. After World War II, there was definitely a significant social shift that became apparent in North America and also globally speaking. You had the decline of colonialism that led to shifts emphasizing indigenous churches and indigenous networks of churches. You had the demise of positivism because people began to realize that the world wasn't necessarily getting better and better, that there was still very much the presence of evil in the world when people began immediately after World War II began to realize the horrors of the Holocaust and other things that had occurred uh, because of the devastation of World War. This also led to the recognition of the limits of humanity and the need for solutions beyond the natural experience, the need for better solutions to global problems of violence, war, genocide, poverty, and um, and the response of Christians and Christian organizations to these problems, their responsibility. This began a dramatic social shift in society. There was also a dramatic spiritual shift because there was a period of stagnation that had occurred in the Pentecostal churches that many of their members recognized. After World War II ended, Pentecostals saw new possibilities and new mission fields, and thus began what is called the Latter Rain movement in 1948. It emphasized relational networks over organizational denominational structures. It began in some prayer meetings after a William Branham revival in Saskatchewan, Canada. It emphasized most of the basic Pentecostal beliefs in spirit baptism and expression of charismata or gifts of the Spirit, but it added a few additional elements. Number one, an emphasis on the fivefold ministry of Ephesians 4, um, pastors, teachers, prophets, evangelists, and apostles. An emphasis on personal prophecy and a strong emphasis on the return of Christ. As a result of the Latter Rain movement, this introduced and launched a long list of healing evangelists and other popular evangelists. Not all of them were directly associated with the Latter Rain movement like William Branham was, but many of them were indirectly, certainly, and most of them were Pentecostal. One of the most popular and well known was Oral Roberts. And he started his crusade meetings in 1948, or at least he started becoming nationally known in 1948. And some dramatic healings and strong healing ministry was noted in his crusade meetings. He also eventually established a university where I attended. And while I attended there, Oral Roberts, there was at least one scandal that occurred when he had a vision of a 900-foot Jesus that was somewhat controversial, but a rather more controversial um, thing was when he prophesied that while he was trying to build a hospital, a Christian hospital, he was running out of funds, and he publicly proclaimed that unless they raised the last, I believe, the last $6 million in the next few months, that God was going to strike him dead and take him home. Many people saw this as manipulative, and eventually, though, he did raise the money in the next few months, and but he was strongly criticized for that. Um, but again, this does remind us that these Christian leaders and evangelists were human. A less controversial but even more well-known evangelist was Billy Graham. Now, Billy Graham was Baptist. He was not known for being Pentecostal, but he was always a friend to Pentecostals. And interestingly enough, he came to Christ in a Mordecai Ham revival. Now, Mordecai Ham himself was Baptist, but he was known, Mordecai Ham was known for being used in the gifts of the Holy Spirit and being a very prophetic evangelist as well. And he led Billy Graham to Christ and was very influential in his life. Certainly, other healing evangelists that were influenced and came out of the Latter Rain movement. One was Jack Coe, and he was in a way he kind of saw himself as a competitor with Oral Roberts, and they had a bit of jousting and bragging going back and forth between each other as far as who had the largest healing evangelist ministry, who had the largest evangelistic tent. And it seemed like rather a petty competition between the two of them, unfortunately. But Oral Roberts' influence was much more lasting and significant. Another leading figure and someone who was directly involved in the Latter Rain movement was William Branham. Now, unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so we're going to finish this in part 2. Looking forward to that.